Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order and note the presence of a quorum. Oh, that's loud.
It's loud today for some reason.
It is Tuesday, February 20th. This is the City of Tallahassee Independent Ethics Board. We are in the City Commission chamber. It is about 1 minute after 4, so I am uncharacteristically on time. The first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes. I understand we had one or two minor changes, and you have a new version in front of you. Does anyone else have any corrections, additions, or changes to the minutes? Seeing none, Mr. Smith moves the amendments and Ms. McNeil seconds. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, like sign. Minutes are approved. That puts us on the Ethics Officer report, and as we always do, we will go through these items one at a time and get any questions or comments or concerns out of the way. And I have a card from Mr. Wilcox on this item. Do you want to talk now, or do you want to just flag me when we get to the key issue? All right. We will wait. Whenever you're ready, jump up and I will get you. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you are recognized on the first item of a long list.
Yes, and these do seem loud this month. I would point out to the board and ask for a little indulgence that the report is a little longer this month, just because we had some items that I think fell under that report category, more for information. So the first item is the memo, which details activities undertaken since the last meeting. There were several educational opportunities this month, both for employees and for members of the different review boards and commissions that exist in the city. We did some website updates to reflect some changes to the City Ethics Code, which we'll speak about later. And I'm trying to think what else we did. We did have our ethics education event for city leadership on January 16th, which I think was very well received. I got good comments after that event, and our chair participated in that and provided some good information for everyone. So I think that was beneficial. So that concludes that report. Oh, I would point out that we have reinitiated, I guess that's a word, the campaign contribution refund program. The candidates, as they have filed to run for office and then changed the seats for which they're running, they've all gotten copies of the form. And I'm happy to report we got 2 already. So that's obviously not a huge number, but we are ramping that up, and we'll begin talking about that more at community meetings, trying to get participation in that. So that concludes that portion of my report.
Okay, any questions, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, on her monthly activities list here? Seeing none, we'll go on to item B. This is the complaints, and we're going to go through these one at a time. Most of them have a recommendation from Ms. Meadows-Keefe, and the board will either accept, reject, or modify each of those recommendations. So on number 112.
Okay. On number 112, this is one that is a holdover from June. It's one that we talked about publicly and met in the shade about, and that's a component of the city manager's case. That has been referred to the Florida Commission on Ethics. And so, what I recommended for that is that it remain pending, only because it hasn't yet been concluded by the Ethics Commission, and I'm guessing the board would want to know when the Ethics Commission renders an opinion on that. So that's why that one's left pending.
So we'd leave it pending. Any objection to that? Seeing none, we'll go on to 117.
Okay, number 117 is one that we've had since November, and I've recommended that that stay pending, and the reason for that is that the city auditor's office, in its audit plan for 2018, said in their plan they were going to do a P card audit. So that's the purchasing card. So they were going to take a look at that kind of citywide. It just so happened that this call that I got pertained to P card usage in a particular part of the city. So being good partners, the auditor staff took a look at that particular issue, and I can't say where at this point, but they looked at it and did not see anything irregular in that division of the city, in that particular program, and that staff auditor reported back to me. However, statutorily, those audit work papers, until the audit is complete in total, is confidential and exempt. So although my recommendation would be to close this, probably what the board should do instead is to, depending on their preference, to keep this as pending until the auditor completes his or her work, and then we can close it. So that was my recommendation. Keep open until final audit complete, and this may take several months. So
the recommendation again is to leave this one open for our purposes, and I assume when this audit is complete, since it's an issue that's been before us, we would schedule a presentation on the audit results.
Sure.
Any objections to that? No. Okay, moving on to 118.
Okay, 118. This is a complaint that we've been looking at since November, and this pertains to an issue that arose in 2010. And my recommendation this month is to close it. We got a legal opinion from our counsel, Mr. Currington, that talked about prosecuting or investigating matters that occurred prior to the board's inception and current ethics code. And also, I received information that this matter's been referred for investigation to FDLE. So my recommendation is to close this matter at this time.
Okay. Any comments on that recommendation? Any objection to closing this? I would note that if this behavior was, if we got a complaint of this nature, that happened when the complaint alleged that it happened after the creation of this board, or certainly after this month, we would be all up in it, so to speak. Okay, moving on to, without objection, we'll follow that recommendation. Number 127.
Okay, number 127 was an anonymous complaint received via email, and this employee believed there was disparate treatment by supervisors of coworkers, and one coworker was getting a benefit that another coworker was not. So pursuant to our bylaws, that matter was referred to the assistant city manager over that division. A copy of the complaint was provided to him. He provided me with the name and number of supervisory staff who had actually already looked into the issue when I got the complaint, and there was a resignation as a result of these allegations. And so based on that, I'm recommending closure of this matter.
Okay. Any comments, concerns? And without objection, follow that recommendation. And then last is item 128. Okay,
128 was another anonymous complaint, and this is an allegation that there is an employee working in a division of the city that is unqualified for his or her position, and that person is only being retained in that position because of friendship with supervisors and management. And the complainant alleges that the individual is basically not performing work and shouldn't be employed any longer. So the action that I took there is that I did discuss this matter with the appropriate assistant city manager and provided him with a copy of the complaint. And I have not yet received feedback from him about any action or investigation that's being taken at this time. So I guess my recommendation at this point is to keep it pending and to follow up at the next meeting.
A question for you, Ms. Meadows-Keefe. Is this complaint against the worker who supposedly is unqualified, or against the manager who is allowing this worker to be employed? Or is it unclear?
No, the complaint is against the manager.
Okay. Okay. Anybody have any problem leaving this pending? So we will see it again, hopefully at some point with a result from the city, and we'll do what we need to do.
And you'll see friendship spelled correctly the next time you see it.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I got a question.
Yes, sir.
And I appreciate Ms. Meadows-Keefe taking care of all these. It just appears to me that we seem to be a focus or a magnet for disgruntled people. Having worked in many organizations, there are avenues for that. I'm not sure what the avenue is at the city, but I would hope that the appropriate ones get there, and then the ones that deal with certain, what we would consider ethic violations come to us. You see, we're getting. It appears to me you get a mixed bag here with these kinds of things, and I'm sure that Julie's got to talk people through that. I'm not sure where she refers them. Maybe we are the court of last resort for many people, because they go, hey, I don't know, I've talked to everybody else, and you're the only people that seem to want to listen. And you don't want to turn that off. But there's some sort of balance. I guess that's what I'm getting at. And maybe I'm just stating the obvious, but it appears to me when I read these and I hear you talk about them, that's what we have.
Mr. Chair?
Well, let me say one thing. What I'm going to do is ask Ms. Meadows-Keefe to get with you and walk you through our bylaws in terms of our process for referring these to the city. I think there's a backstop there that lets the city administration have first bite at things that are possibly not really ethics, but I'd like her to give you those specific citations and documents, and then let you take a look. And if you think they're not strong enough, come back and tell us what we need to do to address that issue, because I have that same concern.
No, and my comments are not meant to be critical at all. I appreciate what she's doing in terms of screening them, but just that, we have to look at these, and it's like, geez, why we're looking at this doesn't even, there's nothing that says unethical in there or screams unethical to me in most of these, especially when you have disgruntled employees who have a beef against someone and are just trying to air that somehow, I guess. And I'm sure that's her issue too, because it takes some of her time, which I think away from the kind of things she should be looking at.
Okay, Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
Mr. Grant, Colonel Grant, I'm happy to get with you to discuss that. And I will say that when I receive these kinds of calls, I try to limit the time I use, and I try to use that time as an educational opportunity for the caller to tell them kind of what my office is about. But then again, I do want to build a relationship with the community. So I never want to tell someone, well, that's not my job. I don't do that. So it's a delicate line to walk. Sometimes you want to be tactful and you want to be helpful, but then you have to realize what your limits are. So I'm doing that all the time.
Mr. Holloman.
I'm going to demonstrate my lack of institutional knowledge again. On the report that we get each month, is that all the calls you got, or is that somehow, have you screened the calls and only presented some of them?
Mr. Holloman, that is the complaints for the month. So that's all inclusive.
Okay.
So the ones you see are the new ones, and I think we're on number 128 now. So we've received total, since I've been in the job, 128 inquiries. So yeah, I just report the new ones every month, and then we go back through the ones that are still open.
Okay.
But these are the complaints she receives. So if somebody calls up and says, hey, I have this problem, and she acts as a referral service, that would not be on the sheet.
Okay, okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You have a
Comments? Okay, next on the agenda is the campaign contribution refund report. And I will tell you, I had a conversation just before the meeting with Ms. Meadows-Keefe, and unless there is objection, in the future, we are going to take off the contributor's name, address, and email, and simply indicate that it's an appropriate, refund, that the person lives in the city limits, whatever the criteria are. While that's all public information, I have a personal concern, again, unless the board wants to overrule or has a different view, that could have a chilling effect on the refund process. We don't really need to be publishing people's addresses and tying them to specific candidates. I'm seeing nods of head, so Ms. Meadows-Keefe, I guess that conversation will hold. So
Okay, great.
you're on.
Happy to do it. The next item,
Campaign contributions, just that we had two.
we had two. And then the next item, I think, is there was a public records request log, and I provided the board members with a revised log. Some of the items that appear are statutorily protected, so that information is redacted. So the board had asked to receive these, and you'll note that these go back to January of this year. There had been a meeting where at least one board member noted that there were not consecutive numbers, meaning that it looked like some requests had not been listed. So what I determined is I was just getting the requests that get sent to leadership, and I wasn't getting an inclusive list. So this list is comprehensive of requests received since January of this year. And that's just for the board's information.
And because there's been some question, we started doing this list just a couple months ago with the idea of us being having a little bit of an oversight role, and there might be things on here that would capture a board member's attention. And if that's the case, they could raise that issue, and we can send Julie off to get the documents and come back and report to us. Also, it might give us a little bit of a heads up, because there could well be something on that, and there have been things, public records requests before, that have shortly after the public records request was made have resulted in complaints to this board. So it's just an opportunity for us to try to stay maybe a half a step ahead or a little bit more informed. So if either at a meeting or after a meeting, if you see anything on here that grabs your attention, you can raise it in the board meeting, or you can get individually with Julie and just ask her to get more information if you think that it might be something that's within our jurisdiction or deserves a discussion in this room. Mr. Holloman.
I would just note how many of these are either resolved the day they're received or very soon thereafter. That's quite impressive. And outside my experience and dealing with other local government or other governments.
And we're going to start on public records here in just a few minutes. Okay.
Budget.
We haven't had a lot since this had to be revised, and thank you whoever caught, since there was I think a protected bit of information. Thank you to whoever it was that caught that.
The Treasurer Clerk's Office.
Well, much appreciated. Next item is our budget.
Okay.
It's a monthly report just of how we're expending the public's money.
Okay. And there, to me, was nothing out of the ordinary in this particular month. So unless there are questions.
Any questions? Seeing none. Next item is, we discussed this last month about having an op-ed on what the board has accomplished, having cut it down to very few words. This was largely at Mr. Davis' request. He was the one who had this good idea initially, I think some months back. It just took us a while to be able to write something short enough. So this was in the paper. You have a copy?
Yep.
Any comments, questions? Mr. Davis.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Thank you for being the idea behind it.
The impetus.
And the Democrat was great to work with. I got it to him, I think it was in the next day or something, so.
Next is F. This is a,
FYI,
no, that's not F, that's
It's
H,
H.
sorry.
H is FYI.
Okay.
That's what caught you. This is simply to provide the board with some information. There have been comments about how much time I spend on the educational component of my job, both here at the city and then also at various locations in the community. And this is a review from somebody that took the class here that had some good comments. So I think that the employees that participate in the ethics education do come away with examples, because if you all have heard me educate, I do love case studies, and I try to find funny ones and ones that'll hold attention. So the education is beneficial, and I especially appreciate the opportunity now to come to the benefits orientation, where all the new hires come to learn about benefits, and they get introduced to me, and they get my information and learn about the hotline.
Comments, questions? Moving on to item H. This is the city's outside employment policy. This is something we've talked about probably over about the last year,
Yep.
really. Ms. Meadows-Keefe?
Okay. Yeah, this has been an issue that the board's been emphasizing, and it was a recommendation to the city from this board that there be a tracking mechanism for outside employment, and we're appreciative that the city did implement this policy. They sent out a memo to everyone. Management has communicated that to employees, and there was a deadline of last week, February 16th, for anyone that's got outside employment to go ahead and fill out the form the board will see there. And it says City of Tallahassee HR Workforce Development Outside Employment Activity Disclosure Form. And this just simply becomes part of the employee's personnel record. And it's incumbent on the employee to file that.
Yeah. And I'd like to say I personally appreciate the city going beyond what even we recommended. The thing in here I particularly like is that the employee needs to tell their private sector employer that if there's a city emergency, they're going to work for the city and not for their private sector employer. I thought that was a nice touch, because we are here to serve the citizens first, I hope. So thank you to the folks in the back of the room there. Any comments or questions on the city's outside employment policy? Seeing none, item J.
Okay. Item J is the result of, in large part, a lot of the board's recommendations, correspondence, letters to the commission, and at the last commission meeting, a public hearing was held on some expansion of the board's authority. And I do appreciate the chair coming that night, and our faithful attenders in the first and second row also coming to speak with the commission. And although the language was not exactly what the board had recommended. The commission did pass some additional authority for the board, specifically around that issue of misuse of public position. So that does expand the number of issues that the board can touch. It also, in Section 2-13, did implement a stricter standard related to gifts, and that they are basically aggregating the value of gifts that one can receive from a particular source, so no more than $100 in the aggregate from certain classifications of individuals and businesses. Likewise, in 214F, there were some changes to how a complaint needs to get reported in order to have a penalty imposed. So those are going to require sworn complaints. But in Section F, it goes on to say a sworn complaint's not required to report a matter on the Ethics and Fraud Hotline. And if the board is concerned about an issue, the board can self-initiate a complaint. And actually, I had to get up and explain that during the meeting because there were questions on that from the commission. And the other thing to note is that our matters, if we have one that's going to be adjudicated, that will be sent to the Division of Administrative Hearings, to an ALJ. And finally, that if a matter is simultaneously referred to the board and to the State Ethics Commission, the Independent Ethics Board is going to suspend, put on pause its review until whatever other investigation, whether that's the State Ethics Commission or other agency, concludes their inquiry into the matter. So that's the first part of the ordinance that was passed.
Okay, let me interrupt. Because this is in part based on our recommendations, I want to highlight just a couple things that either vary from our recommendations or are supplemental to our recommendations. On page 1, line 20, on misuse, they use the word corruptly. We had recommended intentionally. So that's a more difficult standard. On page 3, line 15, they changed the current ordinance concerning the penalties that we may levy for a violation of the city ethics code to now require a sworn complaint. Since most of our complaints were anonymous, that got their attention. And Julie has already pointed out that on page 5, the first partial paragraph requires the use of DOA, and the second, or the first full paragraph beginning on line 10 says that if a complaint is concurrently filed with the State Ethics Commission or with a federal, state, or local law enforcement agency, we would delay action until that action by that entity is completed. I assume that that means we would delay action if we know about it, since many of those complaints that might be made, well, any complaint made to the State Ethics Commission is confidential until they finish, and certainly I don't believe that law enforcement's necessarily going to come and tell us about all the complaints that they receive. So, and I'd ask Mr. Currington if just maybe by the next meeting, if you'd think about how this would apply and what our duty is to know who else is investigating something. I would hope it would be just normal course of business and that we don't have any enhanced duty, but that does occur to me as a potential issue for us somewhere down the road. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you're back on. Excuse the interruption.
That is okay.
Let me say first, are there any questions or comments on Ordinance 17045? Mr. Holloman.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm just trying to work through in my mind the changes made in A and F in 2-14. And I understand in A where it says based on a sworn complaint, and then there's a listing of the remedial actions that we can take if we find a violation. And F says that that a sworn complaint's not required to make a complaint on the hotline, but I'm not sure if that means we somehow roll back into A and have the ability to impose those sanctions or not. So what's the, I don't know, and I don't know if
Self-initiate.
Mr. Currington has opined on that or not, but I'm curious as to what the
He has not
interpretation
given
is.
us an opinion because this language has just passed this month, or the end of last month, I should say. The position that we have taken is, and we took long before this issue came up, is that the board has the ability to self-initiate a complaint. So if a board member saw something in the newspaper or got some information, or we heard testimony, not a complaint, but testimony that gave us pause as a board, that we could create our own complaint, self-initiate a complaint. So what would happen, I think, and again, this may be something we want Mr. Currington to look at for the next meeting, is if we get an anonymous complaint on the ethics and fraud hotline, Julie reports to us, and we say, oh, as a board, we say, oh, we think that's an ethics matter. That looks like a potentially, assuming how the facts turn out, that looks like an ethics violation, but we don't have a sworn complaint, that the board itself or an individual board member who would have to recuse himself would create the sworn complaint. Okay. And the board would move forward if it is an ethics matter. So, Mr. Currington, number 2 on your list for
You have
from
some
tonight.
assignments this month.
Mr. Chair, I got a question.
You're recognized.
Back to 2-6 and the use of the word corruptly rather than intentionally is certainly not what we had hoped for. But now that we have that word, is apparently the legal mind to my left tells me that there is a definition for that, and it's a very high standard.
Yes.
I'm not a lawyer. I don't have that definition, so I don't know what the standard is. Is that in the city ordinances someplace?
No, it's not. And actually, that word is, there are 2 places in the statute where it uses misuse of position. One is in Chapter 112 in the ethics law, and it talks about corrupt misuse. The other is in Chapter 838 on criminal
You're
misuse.
talking state law.
State law, criminal misuse of public position. It doesn't, in 2016, the legislature struck the word corruptly and inserted intentionally and knowingly. There is if you want a decent discussion of what the standard that corruptly creates, there's a 2010 grand jury report out of South Florida that talks about this specific issue in the use of the word corruptly and the legal hurdle that it creates.
And here's the issue I have. I mean, the issue is certainly whoever recommended the word, probably, I would have, well, I shouldn't make the assumption. They know that it is a high standard, and they know the definition, and that's why they put it in there intentionally. And so if that's the case, what do we then do with this? Or what can we do with it? What's in our purview to do? You know, because if something comes in front of us for misuse of position, and then you say, well, it's got to be corruptly. Somebody's going to have to feed me, you know, the Webster's Dictionary for the definition, so then I can try to interpret it in my layman's language, because I am not an attorney. We are just members of, you know, a citizen a board. If we start to have to act like lawyers and judges, that may be easy for others, but not so easy for me. Anyway, so I'm trying to figure out how I wrestle with that, or do I just set it aside and say, yep, that looks like corruption to me?
Well, let's do this. Let's schedule, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, a discussion on corruptly for our next meeting. And we will have legal definitions and examples for you.
Got it.
I think it is not outside. We will do, a lot of this falls out of the self-evaluation that we did in November of 2016 through February of 2017 that resulted in recommendations to the city and to ourselves. I would think that we would probably begin that process again sometime later this year with maybe another set of recommendations in the spring of
Fix the language.
next year. And this is an issue that we can put back on the table. And by then, we may also have some experience with it.
All right, so is it your understanding or the general understanding that because of this wording, if we get a complaint about misuse of position, then we are going to have to conduct an investigation that would bring forth proof, evidence to show under the law that it was corruptly, a misuse of position corruptly, before we could, say, adjudicate and then levy a fine or a punishment?
Yes, as I understand it, if we had evidence that the action was taken knowingly and intentionally, that would not be sufficient to meet the test for corruptly.
Which means that you couldn't levy some sort of punishment, but you still could write a letter.
Yes, we could still do an advisory letter. We've done a couple of those.
Yep, okay.
And we would obviously conduct our investigation, and once that was finished, the results of our investigation would be public. So we would be on record as saying, we see that this behavior happened, we see it was knowing, it was intentional, we couldn't prove corrupt, so we don't sanction it, but that in and of itself exposes the behavior to some sunlight.
Exactly, and that's kind of
Sunshine.
That's kind of my point. So they're trying to tie our hands, but we've got at least one hand free. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Davis.
you mentioned that grand jury report. Is that something you could help us find or cite us to?
Yes, sir. I will. I'll either send an email or I'll send it to Julie. It's in that letter that I wrote to the city attorney. It was a South Florida thing where they recommended in 2010 changing the word corruptly in Chapter 838, which the legislature, as I say, ultimately did in 2016 because the grand jury said corruptly basically requires us to have a co-conspirator who will verify what was in people's minds, and we think it's a higher standard than in criminal law generally, and they didn't like it. So it's been changed on the criminal side, but not on the ethics or the civil side. Okay. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, I think we're on
The next part of the,
17046 AA.
you've got it. This is language that the city approved to place on the ballot in 2018. As you know, this board was created by the will of the voters through voting for a charter amendment. So any revisions to this require yet another vote to change. As most of you know, we were designed, or the board was designed to have 7 members. The board has never had 7 members, and that's because there was supposed to be an appointment by the chief judge. We determined there was an ethics opinion that told judges that it was not appropriate for them to make such appointments. So I think we've gone through 2 or 3 circuit judges that have affirmed that too. In an effort to execute the will of the citizens and the drafters of the charter to have 7 members, the board recommended that someone be put on, and the choice was made that the public defender would be the entity that would make that appointment. The board has a state attorney appointment, and that is Mr. Davis. So I guess it felt balanced to give the public defender the other appointment. So once this gets on the ballot and it's approved, and this public defender makes his or her recommendation, the board would, for the first time, have 7 members.
And we'll need another chair.
We'll need an additional chair. Yeah.
Okay, any comment? This was one of our recommendations to the city that they adopted. Thank you again. Comments, questions? Seeing none. We move on to item 4 on the agenda, which is the ethics moment, a review of Senate Proposed Bill 7020.
And this is an opportunity not only to talk about this, but to talk about sunsetting. And I'm sure the chair could educate on that as well. But we've talked in the past about how things that this board considers and things that the Florida Commission on Ethics considers are confidential and exempt from public records law until there's a determination as to probable cause. So when there is such an exemption present in the law that shields something from public records law, Florida law requires that every 5 years that portion of the statute is automatically repealed, right? Unless there is a determination that it's still required. So
The standard is that anytime the legislature creates a new exemption to public records, that exemption is automatically sunset in October 5 years out. So this law has been in place for 5 years, and this bill was the legislature's opportunity to do an open government sunset review to determine whether or not to continue it, and this bill would continue it by striking the sunset date of October.
So that's all it does, and that's the effect of sunsetting. So that's the ethics moment.
But the important point for the members is what's in here primarily in 2A, 2C, and 2E that relates to us, because it relates not only to the complaints filed with the state ethics or State Commission on Ethics, but to complaints filed with boards like ours that are county or municipal based. So 2A, 2C, and 2E are the relevant parts for us to know.
And the ironic thing about this, how it's been applied, is sometimes the newspaper knows that a complaint's been filed because the complainant makes it known. And so maybe the communications office has a copy of it and will give it out, and then someone will call me and ask for it, and I say, no, I can't give it to you, and they go, well, why is that? We got it from source X over here, and then I have to refer them to this. So sometimes it results in things that the public may consider unusual, but this is the reason why, if that ever comes up.
It's important on line 52, it says the violator can make it public, but the complainant may not.
Right.
We good? Okay, that moves us to item 5. And Mr. Wilcox, I kind of just skipped over you, but you didn't throw anything at me, so you know I'm going to recognize you, and then I'm going to recognize Mr. Sims. And I apologize. I kind of jumped right into 4.
That was fine. I just have well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. I'm Ben Wilcox with Citizens for Ethics Reform, and just wanted to have hopefully what is a constructive suggestion. You know, since your last meeting, there's been a pretty significant story that came out in the Tallahassee Democrat on the corruption investigation that's currently ongoing with the city of Tallahassee. And I would just suggest that in addition to the ethics moment, which is great, and we learn about, you know, issues that are happening in other communities and in the state legislature, that we might have an agenda item where the ethics officer could kind of bring us up to date on where that investigation stands, and maybe highlight any issues that have arisen. And I have an issue that I'll bring to your attention, I guess, at the end when we talk about non-agenda items. But I do have some observations to make about some of the lobbying issues that came up in that Tallahassee Democrat story, and your role as the ethics officer is supposed to make sure that lobbyists are complying with the lobby registration requirements. And as your role with oversight of the ethics officer, I think you also have oversight of the lobby registration requirements. So.
Before you sit down, I'm going to go ahead and recognize you on your unagended item. But first, I want to ask Mr. Currington, I want to put another item on your list. I like the idea of an update on investigations related to the city. However, the amendment, this is in Ordinance 17045, says specifically that we shall suspend action on any complaint if it's being considered by federal, state, or local law enforcement. So if there's an issue that's not a complaint before us, Mr. Wilcox is suggesting that while we not necessarily take action, I guess though having a report in a board meeting is action technically. Would you ponder that and tell us if we follow Mr. Wilcox's advice and put this on our agenda on a recurring basis, if that gets us crossways with the ordinance?
And where would I get
clear?
the information from?
Yeah, I asked you to restate that. If there's no formal complaint,
Right.
you're asking?
So if Julie's aware of an investigation that's being conducted, and it may be just what's in the press,
Okay.
that she would put in her monthly report whatever update she can that's publicly available information concerning investigation of ethics-related matters dealing with the city, and whether or not that gets sideways with Section 2-22B of the new ordinance that says that we shall suspend action on a complaint that's being considered by federal, state, or local law enforcement. My gut feeling is it doesn't, but I don't want to create a problem unnecessarily. Is that clear?
Mr. Chairman, I would just,
Mr. Wilcox.
I mean, it speaks specifically to a complaint.
Yes, sir.
So, you know, I mean, I think you can still discuss an investigation that's ongoing, but, you know, you can't act on a complaint.
Yes, sir. I hope so too, but I grew up on a farm and I learned to watch real careful where I step.
Right.
And I do, as a matter of course, we get news clips here that do discuss these investigations, and I do pretty much daily provide board members with those stories. So I actively find those stories and convey them to board members, and I hear what you're saying. But my question would be, in addition to the news stories that are readily available, where would I get the information to provide said update other than through the media? So that's an open question.
Right.
Yeah. I'd be happy with an update of just media reports.
Yeah, that's fine.
That would be fine,
Yeah.
if Mr. Currington's cool with that.
Yeah. Okay, so Mr. Currington has homework. Now, you have an unagended item, and since you're at the mic, I'm going to recognize you on that.
Okay, thank you. Well, in that Tallahassee Democrat article, it included a paragraph where they cited an earlier article that detailed a person in the investigation, their work for Uber, and mentioned that she had failed to register as a lobbyist, even though she was being paid as a consultant by Uber. And so I think that just might be a good topic for discussion by the board of since you do have this oversight over the lobbyist registration, and the actual city ordinance says the city's ethics officer shall monitor lobbyists for compliance with this section and shall develop procedures for suspension of lobbyists until compliance is attained. The ethics officer will alert the city commission to any instances of noncompliance and will inform the city commission of any need to institute progressive penalties for repeat offenders. So I don't know if we have any of those kind of policies in place, and
It'll be on our agenda for next month. And
Great.
we'll go through what we have and what we don't have, and that may be some more recommendations for us.
Yep.
Maybe even to ourselves.
And the charter also gives you the authority to recommend ordinances involving lobbying to the city commission, so that
Right.
could also be part of the discussion.
Right. One of the issues for us, of course, is going to be if somebody doesn't lobby and they go and have a
How do you know?
a private conversation that isn't meant to be very public, the discovery aspect of that can be interesting. But that's a problem that every government has.
Yeah.
And I do receive, in addition to looking at the policies that we need to maybe have, I do receive updates on who is registered to lobby the city. So the treasurer clerk's office keeps those, and they do make reports to me regularly on who is registered to lobby at the city.
My concern would be
Who isn't?
how are we going to be able to find out if somebody is being paid as a quote consultant and they are, really lobbying?
Right.
So,
All right. Mr. Sims, you recognize, sir.
I have an update on his thing too. It just happened.
Mr. Chairman, it's February 2018. We honor Black History Month. My grandmother lived in Havana, Florida, right over there, 13 miles away, had an 8th grade education, but she always told me that a picture paints 1,000 words. Now, this picture has been altered. Trayvon Martin liked Skittles because of the dye in the Skittles and my heart condition, and I like Skittles. I was too tempted to buy them because I probably wouldn't discard them after this. So I bought what I like, baked beans. Why tell this story? As walking in to hearing Colonel Grant, man I have great respect for, when he worked with the Office of Drug Control, how he gave his life for his country, and then when this country needed him, went back to do that again. And Colonel Grant, I'm very pleased today to tell you that my 2 boys are Navy men. He's a senior in Lincoln, and he's going into the Navy. But why am I dressed like this? What's the point, Mr. Holloman? The point is, one night, an individual had an unethical thought that he could take the law into his hands. And so because of that, we American citizens establish a board to regulate ethical decisions. You are the first stop. When something is in that gray area where it's not quite right, but not quite wrong. Well, I'm sorry, not quite illegal. So just imagine now, 2018, we changed the picture. We have hope. But despite my hope, I'm going to tell you a horrific story. I live in a city that I love, but there's a dark cloud of distrust over this city. How have I impacted me personally? For almost a year now, I've watched my friends get shot down in the streets. I have pulled together an exclusive, comprehensive program to take ex-felons off the street like myself. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not ashamed of that, because your taxpayer dollars while I was incarcerated taught me the value of my 2 children. But let me ask you, I want to commend, and this is probably going to really throw Miss Julie out of her seat. Miss Julie here today. She doesn't give me everything I want, but she has started to teach, and we've created a dialogue of communication where we solve problems and not get involved in personal conflicts. And so, Colonel, and it's so unfair, because I do have great respect for you. I want to caution something here. That we don't send the wrong signal to our citizens and to our employees that they're just disgruntled and mad, because there is too much evidence to prove that it may not all be true, but some of it may be. And for the availability of Miss Julie to hear and to decipher those things with respect, Colonel, is very important. And then you say, well, Mr. Sims, give me an example of that. Let me give you an example of that. Let me show you how what, I forgot, my notes in the chair of what one of your members said, how coming to this brings a light on a corrupt situation before it gets out of hand. Let me give you an example. I was having a difficult time scheduling, listen now, scheduling a meeting with Raul Laving, the assistant city manager who has been designated by the interim city manager to oversee and make decisions on this project. When I tried to set that meeting up following protocol of the interim city manager, his executive secretary talked to me, Colonel, like a third-class citizen, took me all the way back when there was a white fountain and a colored fountain. You know, both gave you water, but the presentation was different. Both waters was legal and sanctioned, but the taste was different. She reduced, all of my committee members are residents of Leon County. But she said that Raul instructions were for me, he would go to call me on my cell phone, and we had to stand around our cell phone in order to talk to him into regards of our project. That's what I call secondhand citizen statute. When we have a $900 million budget, where Mr. Raul 2 years ago received a $50,000 pay increase. Last week he was out of the country with his partner enjoying life, while here in Tallahassee an African-American baby was found in the dumpster, and he left no instructions for my committee. But I went to Miss Julie and made her aware of these delay tactics and how I have been treated unfairly. So guess what he did? Instead of making us gather around my cell phone and talk, he established a conference call number, because evidently we don't pay enough taxes where we can come to his office. So even though we were all here in Tallahassee, we all call in on, got into the back of the bus, even though we all pay the same fare to the guy when we get on. And we rode on the back of the bus and did the conference call. In year 2018. Mr. Holloman, we need you. We need each and every one of you. Because, Mr. Chairman, I guess I'm a pain freak. But even though I'm the only one standing here, there's plenty of us out there. But guess what? I got hope. I got hope. I got hope in Tallahassee, and I got hope in people. Because, Colonel, when I came out of prison, people looked beyond my faults and they supplied my needs. And so your role here today as you embark on this journey, please don't let me go to a meeting and hear stuff about, well, I went to Leon High School with Paige. I know Paige, and a person is innocent until feel guilty. You're right. But I'm going to close the day with this one question. Don't ask it. Don't answer. Anyone ever seen the movie A Time to Kill with Samuel L. Jackson and McCarthy? I'm not a lawyer, Colonel, just like you, but my closing statement today is, imagine if Scott Maddox and Paige was black.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. With that, we are going to take a 15-minute break. We'll be back here in, I can't see the clock, 15 minutes from now. Sued the city over access to a number of public records, some of which were messages sent on a phone that had been, and this is the result. And Julie, are you going to walk us through this, or am I going to walk us through this? How are we doing it? How would you like to do it?
I tell you what, I can start, and then Mr. Chair, if you want to chime in, that's great. Some of this is kind of redundant. The board's been advised about this ongoing issue, so this kind of does talk to Mr. Wilcox's comment about being updated on different things of interest. I have brought to the board's attention the ongoing issue with the public records and the text messages and the lawsuit that was filed. So this document that you have, the memorandum from the interim city attorney to the mayor, commissioners, and leadership team, basically just informs folks about the result of the lawsuit, the judgment that's entered, and that the court's going to be overseeing different aspects of public records compliance until September 2018. So the city agreed to some things, specifically to prohibit text messaging concerning city business unless the messages are captured and retained on a city system, and to prohibit the transmission of emails concerning official city business outside the talgov.com system, and for example, Gmail. So what that means, and what I always have done when I educate people on this, and this includes our citizens that serve on advisory boards, is, people can communicate with you in a number of ways. So you may be Facebook friends, or they may have your, I don't do Snapchat, I don't do a lot of this stuff, but there's just innumerable ways people can reach out to you and go, Ms. McNeil, I know you're on the ethics board, and I'd like for the board to consider X, Y, or Z. Well, so say that's on Ms. McNeil's Facebook Messenger, but it concerns the board. Well, what is she supposed to do? She is, and this is a reminder to everyone, that if you get such a communication, you should forward that to me. You should just copy, paste it, and send it to me, or you can send it to ethics@talgov.com. The bottom line is every word that's written about city business that you might get some other way needs to make it to me, so that if there's ever a public records request, that can get complied with.
I would also point out for all of the board members that if you forward anything that has to do with the board to Julie, if we get the board gets a public records request, she can go through that material and fulfill it without each of us having to individually go through all of our documents. So it is potentially a huge time saver in addition to a central repository that conveniently would comply with the law.
Yes. And I've had people I've known, not here, involved in other matters where, they've stopped their employment and there's a public records request for stuff that they were working on before they left, and they had to bring their personal laptops in, and it's important to keep up with that because you just never know. And the other problem was that with the city phones, there was not a way to capture and retain the text messages. Emails are captured whether you're deleting them or not, and trashing them. There's a way for them to be pulled. Text messages, they did not have that capacity, so the city did invest taxpayer dollars in a system to capture these texts. So that will not happen again. And then there's also encouraging employees to not use their personal emails or their personal devices to conduct city business. So some people who would normally be entitled to a city phone for various reasons, not wanting to carry two phones, consciousness about taxpayer dollars, have said, no, I don't need that phone, I'll just use the phone I have. That practice has now been discouraged, that if you're supposed to have a city-issued phone, you should take the city-issued phone and you should use that phone for your city business. And then there's some continued emphasis on compliance with public records laws. So now every time I go to educate, I'm also including an item about texting and an updating and emphasizing how important all of this is. And then you will see, as the next piece of paper, the final stipulated judgment entered by the court on the case that just basically goes through all the things that the city is supposed to do.
On that item, I would call the board members' attention on the attachment, on page 2 of the attachment, specifically to items 16, 17, and 18 that relate to city leadership team filing an annual statement under penalty of perjury, confirming their compliance with the new policies that relate to the production of up to 100 pages for free and the costs of staff time, and that relate to the treasurer clerk providing staff with a complaint and inquiry telephone hotline related to public records. Those are three things that I had not heard discussed a lot that stood out to me, those three items.
And there's also been, again, a lot of policy education to employees and emails trying to educate employees about these requirements. And so you'll see that evidenced actually in one of the attachments there that Mr. Tim Davis sent to all mailboxes, updating staff about how if you have a city phone, you had to opt in to this archiving software. So you were actually sent something and they said, hey, if you get this message, it's not a virus, it's not malware, go ahead and accept it. And this is the method by which the texts are getting captured. And then you'll see as kind of the last page there that on February the 2nd, the text archiving process was nearly complete, and that you were to type yes when you received the notification that this was going to get installed on your phone. So that piece of the puzzle is now in place. So again, this is informational for the board to update you on this issue.
Okay. Any questions on the new city policies? And everybody's going to be real careful that we don't commit such violations.
Please.
Mr. Currington's like nodding a big smile and saying, and if you don't, I get some billable hours. Item 7 on the agenda
That's
is
Mr.
Mr.
Currington.
Currington. You're recognized.
In your materials is a memo that I...
Mr. Currington, microphone.
Excuse me. In your materials is a memo that I provided on January 23rd, 2018, and it is very limited in scope. I was asked to address what the board's authority is under Section 2, little I, little I, little I, and little v, little I. So I'm just going to call those 3 and 7 for purposes of today. I don't know if those are Roman numerals or what you call those, but in any event, there are other provisions like little I talks about your duty to assist the city commission, and little I V talks about training, and so you have other duties, but this is just focusing on the duties from 3 and 7. In my memo, I also mention that in construing those, I also point you to little v, or what I'm going to call number 5, which is your ability to make referrals to appropriate enforcement authorities, because I think you have to read it in that context. Okay, so with that preface, let me summarize what I think your essential duties are under 3 and 7, okay? And I've put them in priority that I think they should be put in. First and foremost, you have the duty to investigate, prosecute, adjudicate, and penalize only violations of the city's ethics code. I know there are people in the public that were unhappy with that interpretation, but this is not the first time the board has visited that, and in adopting our bylaws, Article 3, capital D, small f, we provided that the duties and responsibilities of the board shall be, quote, to investigate complaints, adjudicate violations, and to levy those civil penalties as may be authorized by the City Commission for a violation of the city's ethics code. We have read that phrase, quote, as may be authorized by the City Commission for violations of the city's ethics code, to modify both the board's duty to investigate and its ability to level penalties. Now, I will tell you candidly, that like the old joke, I've talked to 6 lawyers and gotten 6 different opinions. And depending on the grammar and where you put in a comma or where a better comma could have been put, this clearly could have been written more clearly. So I think this particular provision is a bit ambiguous. As I have advised this board in the past, this board cannot take powers unto itself. All your powers are given to you by the City Commission. So we cannot liberally construe this to give ourselves more powers. I think these 2 provisions provide that you are to enforce the city's ethics code. In contrast, the hotline is very broad. It doesn't say the hotline is limited to the city ethics code. We've all seen rules of statutory construction. The legislature, or in this case, the City Commission, knows when to insert words. It could have inserted investigate and prosecute abuse hotlines in number 3. And then you would have the power to look into abuse and waste and all of those things. When you read this entire provision together, I do not believe that the City Commission has given this board broad authorities, okay? You're not to replace the city treasurer or the city auditor. You're not an inspector general. You are not a catch-all, okay? And again, I know that frustrates some in the public, but your power, I think, is a very limited grant of power. So you have, again, the duty to investigate and prosecute violations of the city codes. Secondly, you have the duty to look at abuse hotline calls. And again, that's a very broad spectrum. Fraud, waste, abuse, and so on. 3, I think you have the ability to clarify a hotline call. If it is ambiguous, I think you can reach out to an anonymous caller and ask them to clarify. for two purposes. One, to find out the exact nature of the claim, and so that you can determine whether or not it's a violation of the ethics code versus, say, a mere violation of human resource policy, in the nepotism law. You are not here to enforce the nepotism or anti-nepotism law. Human resources might, but you all do not. But you have a duty, I think, to investigate an abuse hotline call to determine whether it falls under the ethics code or merely policies and practices of the city or some other body. You may make a referral. As we've discussed in the past, if it's an elections commission issue, then you would refer it to the elections commission. I don't want to split hairs here, but I have a little bit in the memo. I've sort of defined the word investigate. I don't think clarifying a complaint on the abuse hotline is an investigation. Normally, I think the dictionary definition, you're investigating to try to prove or disprove the allegations, to get to the truth of the underlying facts, not to determine what are the allegations. So I think a clarification call to the complainant is not truly an investigation. And I bring that up only to say, if you said, well, Mr. Currington, you just said the word investigate isn't under number 3, under III, and it's not. So aren't you violating your earlier interpretation that the commission didn't you give the authority to investigate abuse hotlines? I don't think getting that clarification is an investigation. And then lastly, I think you obviously clearly have the duty to determine whether there's a cause of action under the ethics code, which you can do and investigate and then prosecute if it's legally sufficient. Or alternatively, if it is not, to make a proper referral to an elections or a state attorney or whoever it may be. And then finally, I say you have the duty to make proper criminal referrals too, if you make a determination it's a criminal matter. Again, I want to reemphasize that you don't have broad, expansive powers as much as many in the community might have preferred. All right. Also, I just want to bring out rules of statutory construction. One very strong rule of statutory construction is you don't want to interpret something to come up with an absurd result, okay? And you want to avoid an unreasonable or an inconsistent construction. If you think about it, and I've said this in the past, why would you investigate or spend your limited resources on investigating an alleged crime when you have no authority to prosecute it? Why wouldn't you? Wouldn't the reasonable construction be to refer it to the state attorney's office, where they are both trained and have the power to investigate and to pursue? So I think your authority under this charter amendment needs to be consistent with that logic. So again, when an referral is appropriate, you send it and those allegations to be investigated by those that have both the jurisdiction and the power and the expertise to look into the matter. I think that captures the substance of my memo. I do apologize. I try, believe it or not to be too legalistic or not to use too much legalese, but I apparently have failed in that at times, as I am reminded.
Questions?
But I'd be happy to answer questions.
Questions for Mr. Currington? Mr. Holloman?
I appreciate your analysis. Thank you. I'm just trying to square it with our earlier discussion about a complaint that's received on the hotline that then is looked at and determined to be somehow a proper basis for a complaint, and then somebody, either the board or a member of the board, then becoming the complainant and filing a sworn complaint. What I heard you say, I'm not sure I can get to that process I just described from your explanation. So is the process that I described where the board becomes the complainant, is that consistent with your analysis?
I think it is. So let's assume we get an abuse hotline call and it's ambiguous. We're not exactly sure what the complainant is saying. And the ethics officer talks to the complainant and with clarification determines, for example, that it is legally sufficient to state a violation of this new gift ban. And again, let me digress for 1 minute. Even though the city's had a gift ban before, it was in their policies and procedures and wasn't in the ethics code. So prior to the city's adoption of that last month, you didn't have the authority to enforce the gift bans that may have been in the personnel or HR resources area. But so Julie investigates it and finds that the complaint now is legally sufficient to state a violation, maybe not provable, but legally sufficient to state a violation of the gift prohibition now. Then this board can make the determination the anonymous complainant does not want to come forward and does not want to out themselves with a sworn complaint. Then I think this board, based on Julie's inquiries and the determination that the complaint is legally sufficient to allege a violation of the gift law now, the gift prohibition, this board would have the ability to decide to investigate the matter and investigate it, determine whether there's probable cause, and if there is, to prosecute. I hope that answers your question.
So, but that would mean that that this commission or the board would then have to, in order to get into the provision of the ordinance that allows penalties to be applied, there has to be a sworn complaint. So this board then provides that sworn complaint.
Correct. Correct. And we have previously had discussions about that. Should it be the chair or should it be an individual board member? And I don't know that we've resolved that, but that is a question, is who would sign the sworn complaint?
And what does the sworn complaint have to be based on? Personal knowledge or hearsay? Or
No, whether it's legally sufficient. So again, with Julie's investigation, if we read this new provision regarding gift prohibitions, literally, and she says the complainant tracked that language, said the defendant or respondent violated the gift law by accepting more than $100 in aggregate in the last year, and those are the factual allegations, not proven, but the allegations, that's legally sufficient to state a violation of the new ethics code, then this board could decide whether or not it wants to file the complaint.
And one of the reasons we haven't tried to cross all the T's and dot all the I's on this is, at least I think, that it is going to be one of those we're going to have to kind of make up policy as we go when we're actually in the boat, in the water. It's hard to know what it's going to look like. It's hard to know what kind of information we're going to have. So the first time we get one, I suspect we're going to be paddling real fast to fill in the blanks. I'm going to ask for a volunteer. At the top of page 2 of Jerry's memo, it points out that the language could be amended to clarify our authority. And it seems to me that could be a clarification, a very narrow clarification that would be consistent with the policies that we've already adopted, or it could be a broader clarification to be more in line with what we have heard was originally the intent of the charter amendment. I'm sort of hoping that I could get somebody who would volunteer to work with Mr. Currington over the next, no rush, over the next 6 months. It could be, it breaks in board meetings, it could be, over the phone, it could be by email, assuming it's copied to Julie, of course, to kind of work on what those clarifications to the board's authority might look like if there were ever another opportunity to amend the charter.
Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to take that role if you'd let me.
Okay, Mr. Holloman, we have a volunteer. Mr. Currington, you're not a volunteer, but we pay you, so it's the same thing. Does anyone have any problem with doing that? Since it is I perceive that as a recommendation in Mr. Currington's memo that we should do that, so try and just take your recommendation seriously. Any other questions for Mr. Currington? Seeing none, we are on item 8, solicitation of legal services. You will remember, well, not all of you, but many of you will recall, Mr. Currington is going to leave, I think.
Just for a moment.
He's going to recuse himself. Got hired in the first few months of our, what was the term we were using, standing up of the board? It was not a term.
Standing up.
Standing up of the board. It was suggested to us about a year ago that we ought to go through a procurement process, a more open bid process for legal services. I said, I think that we would do that in a year, because at that point in time, we had some things going on that didn't fit very well with us taking a break, or having a break in legal services. But the idea here would be that we would now do that, and that we would solicit people who might want to be our attorney. Now, we can do that, we cannot do that. If we do it, Mr. Currington, I suspect, would be a bidder, and the board would come back and evaluate the bids. Julie would come back to us with this worksheet filled out. Yep. Obviously, any of you who have any specific comments or items you would want included in this, you can communicate directly with Julie. I have a couple things I'd like to see her put in. And she will compile all of that along with her good thoughts and whatever we went through when we hired Mr. Currington and the current job description and needs of the board, and we would do a procurement if that is the will of the board. So I guess that's now open for discussion.
So is the contemplation that this would be a procurement run through the city's purchasing department?
We follow those policies and procedures, yes. So we utilize that mechanism.
But would the cities, I mean, would it be the city? No, it would not be the city. It would be
we
us
would do the
doing it.
evaluation.
Be the evaluator.
The evaluator.
But the city would run the process.
Okay, so they'll put out whatever solicitation is, they'll accept the responses, et cetera, and then we'd be responsible for evaluations.
Yes.
Now, it's been a few years, but I seem to recall that the city follows the state purchasing guidelines, I believe, for the most part. And there's a difference when you're procuring engineering or legal services. Are we operating under that exception, or are we doing this under the more standard normal procurement thing?
I believe the rules allow for legal services to not have to follow this process, okay? But there had been discussion about the perception of wanting to have an open competitive process for legal counsel that we didn't have before because there was a pressing need to get a lawyer onboarded. So we're kind of responding to that it would be wise to have this process, and the board voted a few meetings ago to go ahead and do this for the next fiscal year. So we're kind of following up on that. So although we're not required to do it, the board chose to do it, if that makes sense.
Understand.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, so and I apologize, Mr. Chair, if I can continue.
Please continue.
So the, it looks like to me we have two branches or two paths here, and we've chosen one path, and one path being to do a solicitation, to do and run it through that process as opposed to the exception path. But if we do that, and I'm looking at the document that we have, this appears to be a more generic document, not specific to the requirements that we may have. Who is going to put together the RFP document that's more specific, or is there going to be an RFP document that's more specific?
What would happen is, at a future meeting, Julie would come back with this with the blanks filled out. Now, they might be NA in some of them, but with blanks filled out that she would do based on what the board has done so far, the current job description for our contract attorney, and again, any comments that any of us might relay to her about things that we would like to make sure are included. And we would see then, so we would have another bite at this. It's not like we're approving something tonight. This is the process at this point that we would propose using for a formal procurement. So you would see this completed.
So hopefully, if you all have comments related to what you'd like to see on this document, I don't have to be married to this particular form, but it needs to kind of track that. Any individual comments or input you'd like to give me, please call me or send them to me. And I'll make sure those are incorporated, and then it can be discussed at the next meeting. I will say we do need to move on it because we're going to need to start with budget.
And obviously, if if we go down this path, when it comes back to us in a future meeting, if anybody has any comments or changes they want to make then, we'll incorporate whatever.
Then we'd have to pick the person.
But this was a decision the board made about a year ago, so we are not bound to do this. We could just say, we don't want to do this, we want to keep Mr. Currington and be done, or we can continue with this procurement. Now, with Ms. Meadows-Keefe, we do an annual evaluation, a performance evaluation that's excruciatingly thorough. Let me say, we use the detailed city form. We
I
try to
leave the
follow
room,
city
too.
policies as much as possible. So you'll have the opportunity to do one of those, whatever it is, 11-page forms in your future.
You shortened it this
One
time.
follow-up. So it sounds like there may be already a position description for board counsel?
We're going
There is.
to incorporate that in this document.
Okay, can you go ahead and share that with us, or with me? Everybody else?
I can share it with the whole board if the chair's okay with that. Yeah, I'll share it with everyone. It's a public document.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other comments, questions? Just so you'll know, at the meeting where we first discussed this, Mr. Currington's attitude was fine.
Yeah.
That's, you know, he was not only okay with it, but supportive of it, so.
Yeah, Mr. Judge,
That should
make a
influence us.
comment. I do, I support it. I've been involved in contracts where we've had someone who has been the recipient of the contract for a number of years, but at some point, it's always good to take a look at that. And I would especially, in terms of the fact that we're an ethics board, you know, so that we should be certainly at the forefront of that type of thing. Doesn't mean that the same firm may end up winning it, we don't know, but at least it's been out to competitive bid, which I think protects everyone on this board and the city, I would imagine. So I support
Okay,
it.
very good.
And I love Mr. Currington. I think he doing a great job. Nothing bad to say about him, but I just think it's the right thing to do.
Okay. And if it's a will of the board to do this with the chair, I'll vote with you. Okay, next item is item 9. This is the,
What is this? Yeah, it's Mr. Grant's.
Dr. Grant,
Well, it's mine, but I wrote
this
it,
is
but-
the draft letter that would go out broadly to city staff on involvement with campaigns. So this would go to elected officials, to the staffs of elected officials, and because folks in the city will inevitably get pulled into campaigns in a variety of ways, out at least to all of the management staff. We know there are numerous cases where somebody who works in a local government on environmental issues is asked to provide information that subsequently ends up as a kind of almost a public records request, but that information ends up in somebody's campaign brochure. So we wanted to, based on my conversations with Ms. Meadows-Keefe, we thought that broader dissemination was probably a wise thing to do to make sure that just regular old staff who don't see themselves as political at all don't get inadvertently pulled into campaign activities that might get them crossways with what they're supposed to be doing.
And the fact that so many commission seats in November are competitive, and there's strong kind of emotions, right, in the community, it's important for staff to know that if they're asked for comments or they're called at work or any of this, that this is your boundaries. And, you know, this document says it's great that you want to be engaged in the process. No one is wanting to deprive you of that opportunity. But here's the limits on what you can do, and you definitely can't use city resources for that. So, Colonel Grant, this was your suggestion at the last meeting. I drafted this up, and the chair and I talked, and it just seemed like, based on what's going on in our community, it's good to remind everybody in that attempt to be proactive.
Okay. Mr. Holloman.
Couple questions. One, when would this, and when would we anticipate disseminating this?
If we approve it, Ms. Meadows-Keefe would probably get it out within a couple of days.
Okay. And second question, Is this, has this been vetted by the city attorney's office, and is that appropriate?
Okay, Mr. Chair?
Ms.
Okay.
Meadows-Keefe, you're recognized.
Mr. Holloman, the city attorney's office does receive a copy of our agenda, so I regularly distribute that to them, and generally they will contact me if they have particular concerns. But I will say that what I did in this memo, much like the one before, is I regurgitated really what the statute says in the first part, and then I cut and pasted from the city's own policies and procedures. So I really did not do any interpretation of law. It was mainly a statement of, this is what your responsibilities are, and hey, we're just reminding you. So
Let me express my concern, and it may not have any validity, but my concern would be that it's possible that the city, maybe some departments in the city, are going above and beyond the policies, are doing things that are extra policy related, in which case this might conflict with that, and that would be a mixed signal, possibly. So I don't know, that's why, it would seem to me if it was cleared through, because I would hate for us to be in that position of putting out some guidance that was, maybe not completely or consistent with what is going on to the rank and file, in the city. So that would be I don't think it would be that big a holdup to vet it through the through the city attorney's office, just so we don't have that particular issue.
Okay. Comments? Dr. Grant?
Sir, I'd just go back to, the genesis of this, of course, was a follow-up to the Mayor Gillum issue that we discussed many months ago. And then the outcome here has become a letter that's really a guidance to remind rather than point a finger and say, you did bad, don't do that again. What we're saying is, hey, here's the right way to do things. So I support that. I mean, it's not obviously, I think, as strong as maybe I would have liked, but hey, it's got the right idea behind it. So I'm supportive of it. Probably too long for me, but I understand why you did it that way, because you wanted to cite the statutes and those types of things, which are pretty clear. I'd almost bold the thing that says, candidates may not, in furtherance of his or her candidacy, to use the services of any state, county, municipal, or district officer or employee, and maybe even resources, of the state, city, or whatever, in furtherance of that or whatever. So anyway, that's kind of the genesis of it. So because I'm not sure he may have been here for all the backdrop to that, but whatever has to be cleared with or vetted with, I don't have a problem with. I mean, I'm glad we're getting something out.
Well, how about if we do this? I don't want to get in the business of having the city commission put items on our agenda, or of us answering to having to get approval from anybody in the city for whatever we do. But how about if we ask Ms. Meadows-Keefe to run this by the acting city attorney, to ask her specifically if there are any conflicts between this and what the city is currently doing, so that we're not asking permission, but we are making sure that we're not stepping where we shouldn't step. Would that meet
I
with
appreciate your distinction, and I think it's a good one, yes.
perfect.
Okay. And then do you want to bring this back at the next meeting, or can we go forward, assuming that there are no major changes in this? Can she, then, is everybody comfortable with her going forward with sending it out, since we're already in the election cycle, basically?
Yeah, my concern was not about the content at all.
Okay.
It's just about the possibility of.
Understand.
Yeah.
Understood.
So I'll send it after I
We will do that. That moves us on to item 10. As we do every month, I will ask if there are any board members who have anything that we haven't already. Oh, we need to get Mr. Currington back.
oh yeah, he can come back now.
Julie, you want to go get him?
Sure.
And I'll take
Don't
notes.
forget Education is next month.
Yeah. Anything that any of the board members want to have added to next month's agenda that we haven't already talked about? Anything you've seen, heard, desire for us to do? I will tell you that I think Julie was planning, we usually do ethics education for the board, not 4 hours, but something less than that, since we do a little bit of ethics education at every meeting. She had planned to do that next month, but I think Dr. Grant is not here next month, so we might delay that till the month after, but that will be coming. Think about if there are any topics that you particularly would like her to cover, and you can get just directly with her. If there's, for instance, it might be interesting to cover what the State Commission on Ethics has done with misuse of position, since we now have that in our quiver, just to know a little bit more about what it means and to define some terms, Dr. Grant. But any comments you would have about what you want covered in ethics education, you can get directly to Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
Is that next month? Are we doing it next month?
Well,
or
I think we might wait a month.
Okay,
We might wait a
perfect.
month.
Mr. Chair, I would recommend you go ahead and do it. I can catch up on the, watching it on the, I can do it on video.
Okay. So,
Have you had ethics education by me since you've been on the board?
Just the initial.
were you here
Got it.
last March?
Yes, that was my first
Okay,
meeting.
then he
So
got it.
he's got it. So
It's
you're
good.
You're good.
Okay, so we're going to do it in
And-
March or
Yeah,
April?
and March, and I ask
Okay.
everybody if they have topics they want covered. I would suggest that you might want to think about misuse of position as a topic.
Absolutely. And if you'll allow me the liberty, Mr. Chair, if any board member would like to actually do education or a component of education that they feel like they want to share, if they have a particular subject area, like I know Mr. Smith has some experience on boards, and you, Mr. Chair, are knowledgeable about lots of stuff. So it's kind of boring if one person does all the talking. And I anticipate maybe doing an hour, because we do education every meeting. So
Okay.
if anyone wants to volunteer.
Volunteers can contact Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
Yes.
Our next meeting is March 20. Any comment on non-agenda items? Mr. Wilcox, you're recognized.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair and members of the board.
Never be sorry for coming to the podium.
I just, and this is an agenda item, so maybe I'm out of order, but I just had to comment on Mr. Currington's opinion here, where the language in the charter amendment says you have the authority to investigate complaints and to levy those civil penalties as may be authorized by the city commission for violations of the city's ethics code. And then Mr. Currington's opinion, he seems to suggests that you cannot investigate a complaint unless it's a violation of the ethics code. How do you determine whether a complaint is a violation of the ethics code unless you investigate it? And it seems like the language in the charter amendment is pretty clear that you have the authority to investigate complaints. I'm not a lawyer. I mean, I just have to
Mr.
make
Wilcox,
that.
I will tell you, I've talked with Mr. Currington about this, and I think the hang-up here is when he talks about investigate, he's talking about what happens after we've decided that the complaint states enough to move forward. So everything up to that point, gathering of information to make sure that it's a valid complaint and states a violation that, if proven, would be a violation of the ethics code in his mind, and I'm kind of talking out of turn here, but certainly in my mind, that's not investigation yet. Okay. So all of those activities are, I don't know if there's a term of art, pre-investigatory. So I don't think we're necessarily on a different page here from you.
Okay.
Mr. Currington, you want to add to that or correct me?
You said it correctly.
Okay. So I don't think we're far apart here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for making that distinction. And it just seems like the penalties are what is, you're prevented from penalizing someone if there's without a violation of
Right.
ethics code.
Gotcha.
So thank you.
Anything else from any member of the board? With that, our next meeting is Tuesday, March 20th, 2018, 4 o'clock, same bat time, same bat channel, and we are adjourned.